Oh, hello there. You caught me in the middle of playing one of my favorite video games, Final Fantasy Tactics. Featuring fun twists on classic Final Fantasy jobs, a sweeping story of class struggle and sinister plots, and genre-defining tactical gameplay. Final Fantasy Tactics is one of the most beloved entries in this venerated franchise. And yet, here I am in the year 2023, without the means to play this classic game on a modern platform, without ever having gotten proper sequels or prequels to this epic story. Cursed to live in a world of quasi-spin-offs, mobile phone ports, disastrous Kickstarters, and the last proper taste of the game came in the form of a PSP release 16 years ago. But of course, I'm getting ahead of myself. Why don't we start at the beginning, shall we? Oh, Jeeves. Jeeves, a history tome, if you please. Thank you kindly, Jeeves. Let's see here. Developed by Squaresoft for the Sony PlayStation, Final Fantasy Tactics was released in Japan on June 20th, 1997, and later in the US on January 28th, 1998. The genesis for the game itself begins several years before development proper, back in 1993 with a trademark for the name Final Fantasy Tactics. Mainline Final Fantasy producer Hironobu Sakaguchi was, and remains to this day, a fan of the strategy game genre, and dreamed of taking a Final Fantasy entry in that direction, going so far as to take out the aforementioned trademark and begin work on a design document as a bit of a personal passion project. However, with Final Fantasy being as popular as it was, and seeing an entry released every year, the project would fall to the wayside for several years. That all changed when Square hired a new employee, Yasumi Matsuno, known prior to this for his work on the Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre series, which he developed at Quest Corporation. With a pedigree like that, you would assume they hired him specifically for Final Fantasy Tactics, but the reality is that Matsuno simply applied at Square in an attempt to work with a childhood hero of his, Hironobu Sakaguchi. It's simply the invisible pull of fate that upon starting work at Square, Matsuno would learn about the hibernating Final Fantasy project, and he would ask Sakaguchi to please let me do it. Production proper began on the game in 1995, with Matsuno directing what he described as the fulfillment of a dream form, a strategy RPG using the world and setting of a Final Fantasy. While assembling his team, Matsuno would reach out to some former Quest co-workers. Hiroshi Minagawa was brought in for art and event direction, Akihiko Yoshida for character design and background art direction, and Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata were both brought in to compose the soundtrack. All of them veterans of the genre from their time with the Ogre Battle franchise at Quest. Most would also go on to play significant roles at Square, and knowing a good thing when they saw it, Square would go on to outright purchase Quest Corporation in 2002, reuniting the teams who originally created the Ogre Battle games. While Sakaguchi's design document was almost entirely ignored, as an avid fan of the genre, he was still excited to experience the game, and provided support as a producer during development. Although he did make a point in an interview to note that the initial idea was his idea. Credit where credit is due, Sakaguchi. You did indeed trademark that name. Matsuno would go on to develop most of the systems in the game, but for the battle system he would bring in the big guns. Hiroyuki Ito, the man who created the ATB system, aka the Active Time Battle system for the Final Fantasy games. Unlike the rest of the team, Ito was notably not a fan of the strategy game genre. In an interview, Ito said, "I actually never really liked strategy and simulation games. I find all the work you have to do with units, equipping them, switching weapons, etc., to be so tedious and annoying that midway through, I would always put the controller down and walk away. My goal for Final Fantasy Tactics was to make a game that I wouldn't feel like walking away from. I also wanted a game where the strategy would feel exciting and urgent. I really wanted to try adding a sense of swashbuckling heroism, like the feeling of a soldier who bursts into an enemy camp and battles his way out." Given how beloved the game is for its systems, perhaps having a critic of the genre develop the battle system was a proper stroke of genius. While the theme of classism is a fairly universal one in many of our lives, I was still curious how the designers thought about it while putting the game together. Japan is a very hierarchical society, with age and seniority in companies being nigh untouchable signs of superiority and power. It turns out that at Square, this was both true and compounded by the overwhelming respect and admiration certain people amass over their careers. Hiroshi Minagawa has said, "The theme of the class-based society of nobles and commoners that came about because when I joined Square, as you would imagine, there were individuals there who were like royalty. Their talent and their social capital they had amassed. It made me doubt whether someone without those gifts could ever succeed there, no matter how hard they tried. And those ideas, they found their way into the game. While originally wanting to design the battle system for the game, the fact that Minagawa draws from his own life and personal experience working at Square while he wrote the story, it's another serendipitous moment in the game's development that led to it being the respected classic it is today. It's that spice of personal experience. Even when transformed to fit a medieval setting, it's really hard to beat. Minagawa would go on to direct Vagrant Story, a game that also takes place in the world of Ivalice, and a likely future topic for us here at Remasterpiece Theater. All of these things were given visual life by Akihiko Yoshida, a man dear to my heart for his character design work in many games, but most notably for Nier Automata. Rumors that I own a butt cushion mousepad of 2BR. Oh, who are we kidding? It's true, I own one. Sue me! All the cool kids own embarrassing things from their favorite games. Just look at the Sphere Hunter. She owns loads of embarrassing things. Jeeves, something for my nerves, please. Oh, thank you, Jeeves. Thank you. Now, where was I? While the backgrounds were done in a style meant to evoke the sense of holding a diorama in your hands, the characters remained the 2D sprites players were used to after years spent with the Nintendo and Super Nintendo consoles. While I always enjoyed the sprite work for the game, particularly the way the main character's clothing never changed for his jobs like the other characters, but instead it changed to reflect his place in the world and the story, I would be remiss not to mention the character portraits that brought those sprites to life when dialogue is exchanged. In many ways, this art style would go on to inform that of the other games that took place in Ivalice, with Yoshida handling character design and background art for Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy XII as well. Character design was where he found most of his freedom while working with Matsuno, mentioning in an interview, "I frequently worked with Mr. Yatsumi Matsuno, and he had very strong ideas about the world designs in his games. It wasn't necessarily very easy for me to come in and give lots of my own ideas." From what I learned while researching this video, work on Final Fantasy Tactics was heavily collaborative, almost always for the best, but it's no surprise that someone like Yoshida could have felt a little confined in such an atmosphere. Not to mention the fact that here I am, deep diving into the work done by a handful of the more prominent names involved in the game's design, with no mention to the dozens of other folks who were involved in the game's production. Geez, Hiroshi Minagawa really was onto something, wasn't he? Of course, we can't not talk about the glorious music that carries us throughout the game, with a soundtrack unlike that of any other Final Fantasy that came before it. The music of Tactics has always been among my favorites. I know personally when I turn on Theater Rhythm, it's always the Tactics songs that I want to play first, rather than the upbeat, rapid tempos one is familiar with in the franchise. Tactics took a more grounded approach to the music. This came about because the themes of the game were a bit darker than previous games, with struggles afflicting human characters and driving human conflict. This wasn't a game about fighting monsters, although it certainly included that. It was a game about brothers fighting brothers and losing one's way, situations that demanded somewhat more serious music. While Matsuno indeed dictated the tone of the music, it was of course up to Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata to actually compose the music and make it suit that tone. Despite the two composers' setup, they largely worked independently from each other on their own tracks, which is something I was very surprised to learn. Apparently, this surprise is common, since it's something Sakamoto commented on before. Many people have a misunderstanding with the way Iwata and I collaborate. We each compose our music alone. Actually, we work together, but composed most of the music individually. In some cases, we have meetings for some projects, though we know each other not to argue so much. I feel safe with him, but we still have good stimulation for creating fantastic sounds. While each track certainly has its own personality and feel, as a whole the soundtrack is so cohesive that I had assumed for years that it was just one composer, which may be credited to the support network at Square. In an interview with Rocket Baby, Iwata has said, "I received a lot of assistance from Square. It was a giant project, so I profited a lot from the experience." This is a sentiment that Sakamoto shares, mentioning in his own interview with Rocket Baby that, even though I had a lot of pressure, creating the music was a great pleasure for me. Yasumi Matsuno and Nobuo Uematsu advised me not to be obsessed about being within the Final Fantasy world. Then I was able to relax and create my music freely. Personally, I think it's the friendship between the two that really creates the unified experience. The two composers met while creating video games as a hobby while still in their teens, and struck up a long-lasting friendship from there. He used to bring me rare Japanese games when I'm right at a deadline for a job. As you could easily imagine, the game leads both of us to utterly die. Thanks, Iwata. He's a person who's always enjoying something and shares it with his neighbors. He is really good to me. Japanese players of Final Fantasy Tactics were treated to a secret sound test menu, which included the songs composed by Sakamoto and Wada, but also music by Yuko Moira and Yukiko Mitsui. These were from the exclusive to the Japanese version sound novels. Plus, each song came with composer commentary. That may just be one of the coolest Easter eggs in a game ever. Getting commentary like that is very rare for some reason in video games. If you happen to own a Japanese copy, simply enter your name as what you see on the screen right here, because I cannot read Japanese. And that will unlock the secret sound test menu for you. For the rest of you, I included a link to the translated commentary below, which also includes links to the songs. It's great stuff, and I highly recommend you check it out. Now, of course, despite all of the praise I heap upon this game, it wasn't perfect. The translation of the game, despite some real killer lines, was widely considered pretty terrible. There is no grand story or drama behind the bad translation either. It's just another victim of spreadsheet translations that were all too common at the time. If you want more information on JRPG translation from this time period, I would recommend the incomparable Tim Rogers, particularly his series on the translation of Final Fantasy VII, Let's Mosey, a slow translation. Of course, this poor translation would be fixed come 2007. Enter Final Fantasy Tactics, War of the Lions. The PSP release promised everyone a totally revamped translation, one that better suited the tone and setting of the game and more clearly delivered the sweeping story as intended. Players were also promised new cutscenes, encounters, an updated aspect ratio, multiplayer options, and some additional secrets to uncover, including new cameos from Final Fantasy characters. Where things faltered, however, was in the game's performance. Nearly all of the game's many spells and attack effects caused horrendous frame rate drops, making some of the more elaborate summons and magic spells last for an agonizingly long time. Which, funny enough, runs entirely contrary to the design intentions of the original game, where running at a consistent 60 frames per second was a golden rule. Literally, in the very first meetings for the game's design, keeping the frame rate constantly at 60 frames per second was stressed. As Matsuno put it, we want players who have grown up with ROM-based SRPGs with consistent frame rates to be able to play the game and enjoy it in the same way. After all, it'd be pretty lame if this new CD-ROM technology couldn't do what the old ROM carts could. The very reason the game's battlefields are capped at a 16 by 16 sized grid is due to the fact that larger grids would cause frame drops, and that violated the design principle they laid down at the very beginning. Disappointingly, there isn't that much information that I can find on how that slowdown came to be, and why it wasn't fixed before the game's full release. Weirdly enough, it's always the localizers that I see answering questions about the slowdown. In an interview with RPG Gamer, Charlie Sinhaseni, a manager of the localization effort, merely said, "Oh, the slowdown's not that bad, but what little there is in the game is out of our hands." As someone who played through the PSP release several times, while it's true it was out of his hands, I personally disagree about it not being that bad. It was very bad. War of the Lions does provide a unique opportunity for me, however. Here we have a game that got a light remastering, and thus we could probe some brains for exactly how they decide what features get added and what aspects are too sacred to touch. Akatoshi Kawazu, Takamasa Shiba, and Shingo Kosuke served as the producers on the remaster, chosen for their love of the original game. Of course, being charged with updating and changing something you love is both exciting and frightening. I'd been a passionate fan of Final Fantasy Tactics since before I joined Square, so when I heard about the port, my feelings were conflicted. On the one hand, I was happy to be working on a series I personally loved, but on the other, I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to add new content to the original like this. That was the big challenge for me, to create a Final Fantasy port that would both satisfy my older self as a player and my current self as an employee of Square. The initial premise of their work was established early. Don't do anything that would upset the balance of the main game. This limited their options when it came to new classes, ability, items, and characters. Of course, without any additions, a port would probably not sell as well. You want to have some bells and whistles on there, some features that are going to lure in players that are familiar with the content already. The middle ground came in the form of multiplayer to take advantage of the wireless nature of the PSP, animated cutscenes to enhance the story and take advantage of the PSP's very nice display, 2 new unlockable cameo characters, and 2 new jobs. One of which is actually taken from an NPC in the game, Gafgarian's Dark Knight class. The multiplayer aspect was seen as so important that even the subtitle of the game, The War of the Lions, is a nod to multiplayer. As for how they came to choose the 2 new classes, Shiba says, "For the Dark Knight, I remember I was the one who wanted to add him. As a fan of the Final Fantasy series, I think it's the coolest job, and the one I most wanted to play as. With the Onion Knight, there was certainly some influence from the recent Final Fantasy III DS release, but we also wanted to add some classic Final Fantasy flavor. So while we got a classic in the Onion Knight, we sadly were deprived of Red Mage and Blue Mage, two of my favorites. These new classes were designed mostly with PvP in mind, seeking to capitalize on the new platform. The most interesting thing to me regarding all of this is that quality of life wasn't mentioned once in any of the interviews I read. The updates were always about utilizing the new platform's potential, honoring the original release, so on. While these are noble ambitions, I was honestly surprised at the lack of interest in simple things like UI changes, accessibility. You know, the areas I tend to fixate on when I'm thinking about this kind of thing, the things I tend to want when I hear about a remaster of an older game. There were, of course, 2 more games released that bear the name Final Fantasy Tactics. On the Game Boy Advance, we had Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, and on the Nintendo DS, Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift. While these games had some fun and unique ideas, I never found them nearly as engaging as classic Final Fantasy Tactics. Perhaps it was the tonal shift, going from a grounded story of human strife to children pulled into a magical book, or simply the departure from the world of Ivalice, but I bounced off. You have this beloved title, so beloved that a pretty straightforward port with light remastering sold great on the PSP, which was a somewhat niche console. And rather than capitalize on that popularity, they created 2 spin-off-esque titles that fail to realize the charms of the original. That being said, some of those good ideas should certainly find a home in a theoretical continuation of Final Fantasy Tactics. And the games themselves are totally worth playing should you hunger for more tactics. And that hunger for more tactics is very real. I don't know if you've noticed, but anytime anyone, mentions Final Fantasy Tactics, it trends on Twitter. People talk about it all the time. They want more of this game that they love so much. And it's come back to bite some of us in the past.
Here at Playdeck, we have had the incredible opportunity to work on the games that we love to make. And now we have the incredible opportunity to create an RPG tactics game for this generation, Unsung Story, Tale of the Guardians.
With this fan project, we have the great fortune of partnering with one of the most renowned and respected game creators of all time, Yasumi.
Touted as a spiritual successor to Final Fantasy Tactics and designed by the man himself, Yasumi Matsuno, Unsung Story saw all the people clamoring for more of what they loved and said, hey, just give us some cash and we'll do this thing. So we gave them cash. I am one of the Kickstarter backers. And so we sat back and we watched that project run out of money, shutter, get purchased by a new company, become a multiplayer-centric game, have that get scrapped and turned back into a single-player game, and eventually release into early access as a mostly unfinished prototype. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm still waiting for the game. Then, of course, we had the State of Play event on March 9th, 2022, where Square showed off some new games and everyone was once again reminded about how much they wanted a new Final Fantasy Tactics. The Diofield Chronicle got so many tweets and posts about Final Fantasy Tactics that I was convinced that it was happening, that we were getting what I wanted, a remaster or a new Final Fantasy Tactics, because that's what was trending on Twitter. And then I found out it was about the Diofield Chronicles, which, while it turned out to be a fairly enjoyable game, it certainly wasn't the news that Tactics fans like me were hoping to hear. My point with this little bit of the script is that people want more of that pure Final Fantasy Tactics experience, and everyone keeps f***ing it up somehow. Well, enough is enough. Let's figure out how to make Square Enix a whole heap of money with either a new Final Fantasy Tactics game or the best remaster possible, shall we? Mechanically, Tactics is a nearly perfect game in my opinion. So much so that besides very minor tweaks I will cover soon, the combat likely shouldn't see too much of a change. I mean, the job system is stellar, and honestly has enough overlap in skills already that I can't see room for many more jobs. I think the producers of War of the Lions were right on the money there. Some jobs, like the ninja, could stand to have their abilities completely revamped. Because let's be honest, learning how to throw every item category is the lamest way to spend your JP in the game.
If you can
Throw.
the wrench, you
Throw.
the ball. What?
But before we get too into that sort of thing, let's talk about simple quality of life improvements. The kinds of changes that have very little impact on how the game plays, but instead are designed to save the player time and energy, to reduce friction. First up, and most obviously, turn order. The player can get a view of the turn order in Final Fantasy Tactics, but only after digging through a menu or two, and only at specific times. Further complicating the turn order experience is that turn order is displayed as a list of names. The game tries to help you by highlighting enemy names in red. I feel like the one thing I definitely know are the names of my party members, because I name them, game. Like, you know what I don't know, game? You're giving me 6 enemy names in red. I don't know which sprite any of those names belong to. They're all just out there dancing. I don't know who's who. So very often do I find myself trying to time a spell on multiple enemies and having to cross-reference their names with the turn order over and over again to make sure, like, okay, all 3 of these guys are gonna get hit by my spell. There's a very easy fix here, and that's just a nice graphical display at the top of the screen with the turn order. Now we can easily see which enemy and ally does what and when. Have the actions you're setting up appear and move in the turn order in real time as you select your options. Now I know for sure that this spell will hit all of my intended targets. Triangle Strategy and many other contemporary tactical games use this top-of-the-screen system, and at this point I feel like it's basically the industry standard for a tactical game like this. Triangle Strategy does something that I would really like to see in a new Final Fantasy Tactics. When you're making your movements, the game will show you blue tiles, purple tiles, and red lines. A blue panel is a panel you can move to on this turn. A purple panel is a panel you can move to, but is within an enemy's range of attack. The red lines will show you which enemies in the purple zones can attack you. That is so much useful information that is immediately absorbable by the player. I love this. Almost all my changes are in service to giving the player the most information as quickly as possible. I don't want players to feel like something went wrong because they misunderstood something, or to lose because an enemy was able to hit them from what they presume to be a safe location. This is all information that is already available for the player in Tactics, but only if they spend a lot of time digging through menus, selecting multiple units, stuff that slows the action way down, which, if you remember, runs counter to like the basic premise of the battle system designs. Certain menu options are just purely arcane in this game. You want to see how much JP you have left to go before you level up in your next combat? Alright, select the character, go to status, now press X again to bring up any active effects on your character. That's weird, right? Why are we looking at effects? Well, hear me out. Now select one of those effects. There you go. This really should just be a selectable item on a list. The same thing with sorting your equipment. As an obsessive sort of person, I typically buy one of everything, which in Tactics is a huge pain, since the equipment list is a lawless wasteland where trash tier starting gear is rubbing shoulders with my newest godlike items. If I want to change that, I need to go to the party screen, I need to select a unit, select equipment, and then list items. From there, I need to select an item twice, prompting a menu to pop up that has the option of discarding the item or sorting the item list. Again, it should just be a simple list of sorting options that is selectable right from the get-go. Not only are these all very minor things that don't really change how the game plays, they're also, I think, very much in line with the design principles of Hiroyuki Ito. We are decreasing the amount of time players are spending in menus and reducing the frustrations that come from lack of immediate information at any given point in time. We are getting players into the action faster. Of course, I could always have called the PlayStation hitline to help me out. 1-900-933-SONY. At only $1.40 per minute, I could have them slowly explain everything to me. I really do love the manual for the game, bookended by the tip line number, and for an ad for the Prima strategy guide. It's not really their fault, the game is pretty dense, and you can only fit so many pages into a jewel case. Let's take a moment to talk about some of the more obtuse mechanics in the game, and how to make those more rewarding for the player. The Faith and Brave stats, for instance. There are multiple jobs and abilities that let the player adjust these stats on friends and foes alike. Without getting too detailed, higher Brave and Faith stats are desirable for a variety of reasons, but only a higher Faith stat is potentially punished. If you manage to raise a character's Faith to 95 permanently, they leave the party forever and join a convent. There's no such penalty for a high Brave. Meanwhile, a permanent Brave stat below 5 will cause a character to desert your party and run away as a coward. The problem is a lowered Brave is already a viable tactic on the enemy to inflict the chicken status element. Enemies can do that to your units as well, but never as a permanent change. so the desertion mechanic for cowardice is wasted entirely. Like, why not have the chance a character leaves for having too high a faith stat begin when they hit 85 or 90 faith? And then, after they hit this new number we're choosing, make every point after that be a roll of the dice, a gamble by the player. Perhaps add something like that for Brave as well, a Berserk-style effect called Righteous Anger that limits your control over a high bravery character. And at 90 and above, you begin to roll the dice on them leaving your party to right some wrong as a lone hero. Give me some risk-reward dynamics for both of these stats. Then, of course, we have the Zodiac system. Some Zodiac signs have high compatibility with others, which is to say that if your Time Mage has a compatible sign with your Thief, and you're trying to cast Haste on him, it increases the odds that the target effect will hit. To this day, I still do not know which signs have what reactions to other signs. I do not know astrology, and I never will. Please, have that information be reflected somewhere on the calculation screen that you see when you're confirming your actions. A very special thanks to the Battle Mechanics Guide by Aerostar for finally teaching me all the behind-the-scenes math in the game in regards to these mechanics. The confirmation screen currently just tells me two things: the % chance that my selected action will succeed, and whether or not there is a counter action involved. Not even the success rate for the counter action, just that it exists. I believe we could add so much more to that screen and give the players the odds to hit what Zodiac interaction is happening, the chances the reaction will trigger so we can gamble on counters with more information, and so on. Like, speaking of telling us more detailed information on the party roster screen regarding how various skills are calculated would also be nice. For instance, the samurai skill Murasame isn't affected by Zodiac, but is instead solely calculated based on the character's magic attack multiplied by 12. Again, the Battle Mechanics Guide has been very informative. None of this is presented to me in the game, so I had to learn it through him. And now, of course, for a change that is weirdly controversial when you're talking about the modernization of older video games, and that is autosave. Autosave is the greatest thing to happen to video games ever. Period. Full stop. Like, I can't tell you how many times I have revisited an older title and had to replay the first few hours because I forgot that manual saving is all that there was for years. And autosave isn't the only save-related change we need to address for the game either. There are several times in Final Fantasy Tactics where the player is forced into multiple battles, and the game will give you the chance to save between those battles. Now, this seems nice on the surface. It seems quite nice, doesn't it? But in reality, this is a horrible trap. You see, now that you have saved between these multiple battles, when you load that save, you're going to find yourself on the party roster screen, not the map. This could be a big problem if you find yourself underleveled with no way to get out and get more experience to level your team. You are now forced to overcome this fight with whatever you currently have. The end of Chapter 3 is a particularly savage example of this. After several fights, the player finds himself in an encounter with Ygraph, but the first phase of the fight is a one-on-one fight with just your MC, Ramza. Ygraph has a high speed stat, and depending on your Ramza, there are even moments where Ygraph gets 2 turns before you get 1. In my last playthrough, linked in the description below, Ygraph can kill my Samurai Ramza in 2 hits, so a double turn for him is just an instant loss for me. If someone decides to, say, level their Ramza as a support character, you know, he's doing some healing, he's doing some time magic, he's not doing damage, that's gonna be a bad time for them. They could very well find themselves soft-locked forever here, doomed to load a save where their build is nearly incompatible with winning the game. Hell, even if you manage to defeat Ygraph, who is seemingly programmed to keep his distance from you and beat you down with holy sword attacks and shockwaves, you then get to fight his demonic form and his 3 demon buddies, who all have devastating long-range attacks. It should never be possible for a player to be soft-locked out of completing a game due to a feature as fundamental as saving. Multiple autosave slots that step back once per fight would give the player the option to go and level up different jobs and come back to a situation with a different build and different options. Even just a warning that entering a certain point on the map will result in multiple battles without the chance to leave would be enough to prompt the player to make a separate save file to be safe. The Ygraph fight does bring to mind the balance of the game's encounters. While I never really considered Tactics to be an overly hard game, my last playthrough being one I streamed really opened my eyes a bit to the reality of some of the aspects regarding the balance. You see, when I play Tactics alone, I grind my jobs for fun. I find the combat so enjoyable that I just find it nice to get into a lot of random fights and level various abilities. It's kind of a zen thing for me. On stream, I avoid grind because it's not as fun to watch as, new story beats and such. So with my new experience as a non-grinding player, I can see that the game certainly does have pretty intense spikes in difficulty, often due to poor matchups against your party. Since I enjoy difficult encounters, I don't really see that as a problem per se. Instead, it's the lack of certain tools here that would allow players to overcome said encounters that I want to address. We really need a system in place to level out of party characters so that players have more diverse party combinations available at any given time. The player typically gets to take 5 units into fights, which, thanks to humans only having so many hours in a day, means they typically play through the game with the same 5 characters. By Chapter 4, most of those characters are in their final forms, slowly working towards some of the more expensive late-game abilities. Meanwhile, in the barracks, they have a pile of level 1 characters who will be sent off to do pub missions from time to time. And then, of course, when some of the more exciting NPC characters with unique jobs join the team, even some of your more veteran units are doomed to join the benched crew and languish forever, in favor of keeping the cool new character leveled with the team. It makes me sad that we could hold so many units, but unless I want to grind through the game at a snail's pace, none of them will get their time in the sun. All units in a battle earn JP based not only on their current job, but the jobs of the friendly units around them on your team. Your chemist will learn how to ninja if the team has an active ninja, for instance. Maybe something similar should happen for the benched folks. That, or sending them off on pub missions, should reward more than a pittance of JP for what was a 16-day expedition. We could also introduce a new option in towns. Training grounds, where you could designate growth paths for your units. Similar to how the education works in Fire Emblem Three Houses. Leave some units there to train towards specific jobs. As the days pass, they gain XP and JP and switch through the jobs needed to become the target job. Obviously, don't give the player a complete list of jobs, only have the ones they've already figured out on their own. Basically, it's what you're already doing with most of your active units, but it's happening off in the background for your background characters, your benched units. Personally, I think I would tie the amount of XP and JP those training ground characters are going to get based on what my party's getting as I'm off doing other stuff. That way it's fairly equal. Whatever method we choose, the end result is a party roster that includes more than just 5 capable fighters locked into their jobs. Instead, we now have a nicely sized pool of warriors we could swap in and out depending on what we feel like, or of course to counter a particularly challenging encounter. And of course, whenever we leave units in a town to do anything, have icons on the damn map indicating this. I literally lost a few benchwarmers for a while because I just couldn't remember what town I sent them off on a pub mission for. I'm pretty sure I still don't have 2 of my units. They're still out there somewhere. Speaking of random encounters, it would be nice to have them be based on where the player is currently in the story. It would make sense to encounter battalions of the various factions near their territories. And if the player talks to the tavern owner about local rumors, we could reveal said encounters on the map, making them less random and turning the rumors in the game from simple flavored story recap to a functional mechanic. It would even let players use random encounters to hunt. Like, take this, you go to that tavern, right? And you talk to him and you get some rumors. And he tells you, like, hey, down the road, there's a garrison set up, they've got a summoner, they've got a fighter, they've got an archer. And you're leveling up a summoner. Now you can go down. You can get into that fight on purpose, specifically so you could kill that summoner and harvest his skill crystal and get some free skills from his crystal. That would be so cool! We could also give the pub some procedurally generated side quests to go on, similar to the errand system, but ones that the player actively participated. The Poacher's Den could have a request system, giving the player specific monsters to hunt and poach. Really, I just want more Final Fantasy Tactics in my Final Fantasy Tactics. The multiplayer system from the PSP release can see some pretty major updates too. Weekly themed battles. Bring the judges back from Tactics Advanced to enforce special rules for multiplayer battles. Have tournaments. With modern consoles in the PC multiplayer scene, wow, there's some real potential for some good times here. Plus, with the changes discussed earlier that introduce more ways to level benched characters, you could have multiple different teams together for various multiplayer metas. It would be infinite Final Fantasy Tactics. Plus, of course, co-op campaigns would be awesome. I want entire multi-mission campaigns to play with friends. All of these thoughts and ideas would work great in a remake of Tactics, but they would also be at home in a sequel or prequel as well. The events of the 50 Years' War that set the stage for the story of Tactics would be an interesting setting to explore. A story told over such a long span of time could see generational conflict and tap into the pathos around the concepts of legacy, parenthood, greed versus the desire to leave a better world. A lot of the driving forces from the story of Final Fantasy Tactics can be hinted at in a prequel, while the bulk of the focus can be on telling an entirely new story. People with no experience with the first game would still have a good time, while fans would see the slow gears of the church grinding in the background, and the familiar family names marching toward their inevitable destinies. If we opt for a more straightforward remake, I only have one real note for the story. Chapter 4 sees the story kind of split. Ramza, the main character, deals with the church and the plot to release Saint Ajora and a bunch of demons on the world, mostly because they stole his sister as a vessel for Saint Ajora. Delita, meanwhile, goes off to use Ovelia to legitimize a claim for rulership, and goes down in history as a unifier of the kingdom. So much of that Delita stuff happens off-screen though, and I wouldn't mind having an expanded epilogue that shows a bit more of where the political intrigue plot went after Ramza gets roped into the church's plot. Oh, totally keep the stinger of Ovelia and Delita, but just do a bit more to set that up, make it feel a little bit more earned. Graphically, there have been a few games in recent memory that I think bring some very good ideas to the table. Look at Octopath Traveler, Bravely Default, and especially Triangle Strategy. These are games with gorgeous character sprites that exist in stunning 3D environments, and they take full advantage of the latest technology when it comes to lighting and effects. Imagine some of the spells and summons in Tactics with real-time lighting, physics, and particle effects. They're already gorgeous as is, but man, imagine Shiva, fully animated, with ice crystals bouncing off the walls and trees. Keep the units as sprites, but up the number of frames and place them in fully realized 3D environments with dynamic lighting. Night fights, lit by torches that explode in luminance with a fire spell. Instead of just 4 points of rotation, have full control of the camera. That would be great, let us explore the diorama, let me rotate it around. Let me really get in there and appreciate the artistry of the environmental design. Again, all of this is in line with what we have learned about the design intentions of the original game, but unfettered by technological limitations. Of course, I would also just be happy with getting a remaster that fixes all of my primary complaints, but let's be serious, a full-on remake with all of this gorgeous kind of graphical stuff would be chef's kiss. Whatever they choose to do, I just pray we don't get another pixel smoothing situation like with the latest version of Tactics Ogre. The new remaster of Let Us Cling Together is great in many ways, but boy, do I dislike pixel smoothing. It just makes it look like they're melting to me. I like the crisp, clean look of the original pixels, just higher definition, more frames of animation. Now, interestingly, the localized version of War of the Lions did include voice acting for the animated cutscenes. Now, this apparently being a decision made on the localization end and not at the development end. I'm all for voicing as much of the dialogue as possible. Give me dramatic reads of that good dialogue. Let me hear the demonic influence creep into Makavi's voice as they impersonate a human. I feel like there's a lot of room in the dialogue of this game, especially the War of the Lions version, for voice actors to have a lot of fun with these roles. Of course, any scenes that take place on battle maps should be told through sprite animations, because those are my favorite scenes in the game and they look awesome. As for the music, just bring back Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata to make a few new tracks and remaster the classics. Nothing more to say there, the music is perfect. Sound effects, on the other hand, I'm still a sucker for the original game's release sounds. War of the Lions, for some reason, turned some of those sounds into computerized beeps and boops. I feel like the defeat of an unholy Lucavi demon should have some fantastical sounds and not dial-up modem sounds. Plus, we're no longer limited by the size of a CD-ROM or a UMD. I almost forgot the name of that stupid proprietary disc they used for the PSP. Anyway, the sound design no longer needs to be so limited. Let's get some really great sound work in here. Square Enix as a company seems to almost be cursed when it comes to their older catalog these days, to the point where the type of experience and quality you could expect from them revisiting a legacy title is pretty random. Final Fantasy VII Remake is secretly a sequel, masquerading as a remake. Chrono Cross Radical Dreamers Edition was a broken mess on release. The pixel remasters of Final Fantasy 1 through 6 are amazing updates, both in terms of how the games look and sound, but also for quality of life and gameplay experience. So long as we don't get teased with something and end up with NFT garbage, I will probably be happy. I'm looking right at you, Symbiogenesis. Way to besmirch my baby Parasite Eve. No one wants NFTs, Square. We want more Parasite Eve. You didn't even put Parasite Eve music and theater rhythm. You put Xenogears in there. You put all these other games in there. Why no Parasite Eve, huh? Why no Parasite Eve? You know it's my favorite goddamn game. Like, why are you doing this to me? Stop it with the NFTs. Stop it, Squeenix. Whew, well, there you have it. A history on the development of Final Fantasy Tactics, and a theory-crafted revisit based on the design principles we discovered in that history. Modernized of body, but classic of soul. A path into a bright future for what should have been a long-running spin-off franchise that sadly got relegated to mobile phone releases in the modern day. I mentioned earlier that these ideas can go into either a remake or a new entry, but I would like to clarify right now that what we, the tactics-loving people, deserve and want is both. Well then, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Remasterpiece Theater. Was there something I missed in my history of the game? Or perhaps a feature for a modern version that you think should be included? Any new jobs you think would shine? Let me know down in the comments. And of course, if there's another game you feel I should cover in this series, please let me know. I swear I'm gonna get them out faster now. If you enjoyed yourself, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content in the future. In the description below, you can find links to sources and resources mentioned in the video, along with links to our Twitch stream and Discord. If you would like to support these videos and see them happen more often, there's also a link to our Patreon down there. Until next time, stay well and play the games you love.